Hello, this is Dr. Hutch again, and we will be covering nervous system part 2, the divisions of the nervous system today. So let me share my screen with you with the PowerPoint. Okay, let's start out with the general characteristics of the central nervous system. So of course, the two major divisions are central nervous system, peripheral nervous system, and then you can subcategorize those further, which we will talk about later in this recording as well as other recordings. So the central nervous system, we're talking about the brain and spinal cord, everything right down the center. And so we consider the brain to be the largest and the most complex portion of the nervous system. The brain controls sensation, perception, movement, thinking. And the brain, of course, has two cerebral hemispheres, so two halves. Now, as you go internally, you'll see an area in the center called the diencephalon. And then below that, you have the brainstem, and then the cerebellum. And the cerebellum is at the back of the brain, and we'll talk more about that later on. The brainstem connects the brain to the spinal cord. But the brainstem is a lot more than just a connection. It actually has a lot of functions, which we will talk about also. So both the brain and spinal cord connect to the peripheral nervous system by the way of peripheral nerves. And we're talking about the cranial nerves and the nerves, well, and the cranial nerves are the ones that come out at the bottom of the brain at the stem. And then you have the spinal nerves that come out of the spine, lower down. Both the brain and the spinal cord are covered by meninges, and these are membranes that protect the brain and spinal cord, and they lie between the bone and soft tissues of the nervous system. Again, meninges consist of three layers: the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater, going from more superficial on the outside to the pia mater, which is on the inside. So the dura mater is the outer layer. It's a tough, dense connective tissue. It has dural sinuses and an epidural space. The arachnoid mater is a middle layer, and it's web-like. The subarachnoid space contains cerebrospinal fluid. And then the pia mater is the inner layer, and it's attached to the surface of the brain or the spinal cord. It contains blood vessels and nerves, and it nourishes the central nervous system. Okay, and this figure shows you the meninges. Again, going from out to in, dura mater, arachnoid mater, pia mater. And notice that these meninges go all the way down the center of the hemispheres of the brain. And now when we look at the spinal cord, you'll see the same arrangement. You have the dura mater on the outside, the arachnoid mater, then the pia mater. And remember, the spinal cord goes through the vertebral foramen. Okay, and we'll talk more about that later as well. Cerebrospinal fluid is produced in 4 ventricles. These are interconnected cavities in the cerebral hemispheres and the brainstem. And the ventricles are continuous with the central canal of the spinal cord. The 4 ventricles include the 2 lateral ventricles. And this is called the first and second ventricles, then the third ventricle, and then the fourth. The interventricular foramina connect the third to the lateral ventricles, and the cerebral aqueduct connects the third and fourth ventricles. And this figure shows you the ventricles of the brain. I expect you didn't even know you had these cavities in there. Okay, the cerebrospinal fluid. This is secreted by the choroid plexuses. These are specialized capillaries of the pia mater that's covered by ependymal cells. Selective transfer of the substances from the blood occur to form cerebrospinal fluid. And it has a nutritive and protective function of the central nervous system neurons. It helps maintain stable ionic concentrations in the central nervous system, and it circulates in the ventricles, the central canal of the spinal cord, and the subarachnoid space. After exchanging substances, cerebrospinal fluid is absorbed by the arachnoid granulations. And the volume is about 140 milliliters at any time. That's not a small amount. Figure 11.4 here shows you the cerebrospinal fluid and the pathway by which it really takes. Okay, and it's constantly flowing through those areas in those ventricles. Okay, clinical application in traumatic brain injury. So this is a result of mechanical force like a fall or an attack or accident or sports injury. A concussion is a mild traumatic brain injury and typically results from one-time injury and has no lasting symptoms. A chronic traumatic encephalopathy is often sports-related or from mild repetitive TBIs, or results from many small injuries over time, and symptoms begin years later and have long-lasting effects on the memory and behavior. And then there's blast-related brain injury. This is a severe TBI, resulting from explosions, say in combat situations, and often leads to cognitive decline years after the injury. They also cerebrospinal fluid pressure. So you have a continuous secretion and reabsorption of the cerebrospinal fluid, and this keeps the fluid pressure in the ventricles constant. Any interference with the circulation of the cerebrospinal fluid, like infection, tumor, blood clot, this can increase the intracranial pressure in the ventricles. And this can lead to a collapse of the cerebral blood vessels, injury of the brain tissues compressed against the skull. A spinal tap or lumbar puncture is used to measure the cerebrospinal fluid pressure. And pressure can be relieved by insertion of a drain into the subarachnoid space. Hydrocephalus in an infant, also called water on the brain, can be treated by insertion of a shunt. This figure shows you where a lumbar puncture would be made, and also shows you a CT scan of the brain, and it shows you the ventricles. So here we have normal, and here we have the scan with accumulated fluid. The brain contains centers for and performs these functions. It's a neural center for sensory function, center for sensations and perceptions, motor commands to the skeletal muscles, higher mental functions such as memory and reasoning. It has neural centers for coordinating muscular movement. It has neural centers for regulating visceral activities of the organs, and of course, your personality. So the brain starts out as a neural tube and gives rise to the central nervous system early in development. The brain forms from three vesicles or cavities. The forebrain, called the prosencephalon, the midbrain, called the mesencephalon, the hindbrain, called the rhombencephalon. The forebrain divides into the telencephalon and diencephalon. The mesencephalon continues and persists. The hindbrain divides into the medencephalon and the myelencephalon. And then these five cavities persist in the mature brain as the ventricles and tubes that connect them. The forebrain becomes the cerebrum, the basal nuclei, and the diencephalon. The mesencephalon remains as a midbrain, and the hindbrain becomes the cerebellum, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. This figure shows you brain development through time. This table shows you the structural development of the brain and summarizes what each of the different portions become eventually. The major portions of the adult brain include the cerebrum, the diencephalon, the cerebellum, and the brainstem, which includes the midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. This figure is a sagittal section of the brain and spinal cord. And I'll make this a little bit larger so you can see it. Okay, so this is all the cerebrum. The center part is the diencephalon. It's separated by the corpus callosum, which is connective tissue, or the corpus callosum actually combines the two hemispheres, so it attaches them. You have this major area here in the middle. We'll talk more about this, the thalamus. Okay, at the back of the brain, you have a pineal gland that produces melatonin for basically sleep. Underneath the thalamus, towards the front, we have the hypothalamus. Then we have the pituitary gland. And of course, the pituitary gland has many functions for the endocrine gland later on, or for endocrine function, I should say. Then you have the brain stem that's composed of the midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. And then at the back of the brain and the bottom, the cerebellum. So the cerebrum is the largest part of the brain. You have two cerebral hemispheres, and they're separated by the falx cerebri. Then we have the corpus callosum that connects the cerebral hemispheres. You have gyri and sulci. The gyri are the ridges or convolutions. The sulci are the shallow grooves. And then you have fissures, which are deep grooves in the surface. You have longitudinal, which separate the cerebral hemispheres, and a transverse fissure, which separates the cerebrum from the cerebellum. There are 5 lobes of the cerebral hemispheres: the frontal, the parietal, the temporal, the occipital, and the insula. The insula is deeper within the lateral sulcus, so you don't see it superficially. So 4 of the lobes are named for the bones that they underlie. And you see that on this figure. Got the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital, and temporal. And then the insula is deeper in. Let's look at the cerebrum in more detail. The cerebral cortex is a thin layer of gray matter, which makes up the outermost layer of all the outer lobes of the cerebrum. And remember, gray matter is mostly the neuron or cell bodies. Okay, there's no myelin there. It contains almost 75% of the neuron cell bodies in the neuron system. But in the other part would be unmyelinated axons. Now, the white matter of the cerebrum, this lies under the cerebral cortex and makes up most of the cerebrum. And it contains bundles of myelinated axons that connect the neuron cell bodies in the cerebral cortex to other portions of the nervous system. Functions of the cerebral cortex, the most outer part of the cerebrum. So the cerebral cortex is responsible for the higher mental functions, like interpreting impulses from sensory organs, initiating voluntary movements, storing information as memory, retrieving stored information, reasoning, and is the seat of intelligence and personality. The cerebral cortex can then be divided into sensory, association, and motor areas. And there's some overlap of these. Each area contains a group of neurons that work together to perform a particular function. And this figure shows you the functional areas of the cortex. Here's the frontal eye area. Here's an area involved in concentration and planning at the front. Here we have the auditory areas of the temporal lobe. Here we have Broca's area. We'll talk more about that later on. Here at the temporal lobe, the interpretation of auditory patterns area. Moving towards the back of the brain, the motor areas involved with control of voluntary muscles. And here we have the sensory areas. So they're divided evenly at the middle of the brain, from the side anyway, from a lateral view. We have vernix area. We'll talk more about that. Here at the occipital area, we have an area that combines visual images and visual recognition of objects. Okay, at the very back of the visual area, and we'll talk more about cerebellum later on. Okay, the sensory areas of the cortex. So the cutaneous sensory areas are in the parietal lobe, and they interpret sensations on the skin. Then you have the sensory speech area called vernix area. This is at the temporal and parietal lobes, usually the left hemisphere. Here we have understanding and formulating language functions. Then we have the visual area. This is at the occipital lobe. It interprets vision. Then we have the auditory area. At the temporal lobe, it interprets hearing. Then we have the sensory area for taste. This is near the base of the central sulcus. It includes part of the insula. Then we have sensory area for smell. This arises from the centers deep within the temporal lobes. Okay, and you see that here in B, basically, which are the sensory areas. Okay, and in this picture, you see the sensory area is basically just posterior to the motor areas. Okay, if you're looking at the brain from the top, from an anterior view. Okay, this is called a homunculus, and we've actually mapped these different areas of the cortex as to specifically what areas they sense. And notice it goes all the way down into the sulcus. Okay, we also have association areas. These are regions that are not primarily motor or sensory. They connect each other and to other structures in the brain. They're widespread throughout the cerebral cortex. They analyze and interpret sensory experiences, and they provide memory, reasoning, verbalization, and judgment and emotions. So the association areas of the cortex, at the frontal lobe, we have concentration, planning, complex problem solving, also emotional behavior, and judging consequences of behavior. Then the parietal lobe association areas include understanding speech and choosing words to express thoughts and feelings. And then the temporal lobe association areas. Here we interpret complex sensory experiences like understanding speech and reading. And we store memories of visual scenes, music, and complex patterns in these areas. The occipital lobe association areas analyze and combine visual images with other sensory experiences. And then the insula, we translate sensory information into proper emotional responses. The motor areas of the cortex. This is right in front of the sensory area. The primary motor areas are motor cortex, or the frontal lobes. They control the voluntary muscles. Most of the nerve fibers cross over in the brainstem, actually. Broca's area. This is anterior to the primary motor cortex and usually in the left hemisphere. It controls muscles needed for speech. And then the frontal eye field. It's above Broca's area, and it controls the voluntary movements of the eyes and eyelids. And you see that here in the first picture, which shows the motor areas. And again, it's a homunculus, and it shows you which areas send information out and where it goes to. Table 11.3 summarizes functions of the cerebral lobes. There is hemisphere dominance in our brain, and the left hemisphere is dominant in most people. The dominant hemisphere, wherever that might be, controls language skills of speech, writing, and reading, and verbal, analytical, and computation skills. Your non-dominant hemisphere will control nonverbal tasks, motor tasks involving orientation in space, understanding and interpreting musical and visual patterns, and it provides emotional and intuitive thought processes. And I'm sure you've heard of people being more left-brained or right-brained. That's kind of what this is referring to some degree. Let's talk more about memory. So memory is a consequence of learning, and it involves persistence of learning. And there's two types: short-term or working memory and long-term. In short-term memory, neurons are connected in a circuit, and the circuit's stimulated over and over. When impulse flow ceases, the memory does also, unless it enters the long-term memory stage via memory consolidation. In long-term memory, this holds more memory than short-term and lasts a lifetime. It changes the actual structure or the function of the neuron, and it makes new synaptic connections by increasing branching of processes. So when you are learning to try to memorize things, it creates actual physical connections between these neurons. It's like a pathway that you go down over and over again. In long-term potentiation, you have an increase in neurotransmitter release and effectiveness of synaptic transmissions upon repeated stimulation. So if you keep using that information, you will actually have more efficient neurotransmitter release. Okay, the basal nuclei. These are sometimes called the basal ganglia. And remember, that means a group of cell bodies. So technically, a ganglion is a cluster of the neuron cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. But here, we're talking about central nervous system. These are masses of gray matter that are deep within the cerebral hemispheres and consist of the caudate nucleus, the putamen, and the globus pallidus. They produce dopamine, and they help control voluntary movement. All right, and the basal nuclei are shown here in this figure. Clinical application, Parkinson disease. In this disease, neurons degenerate in the substantia nigra, which produces the neurotransmitter dopamine. So less dopamine then reaches the basal nuclei. Dopamine deficiency will lead to motor problems such as tremors, shuffling gait, rigidity, small handwriting, speech difficulties, and mask-like face. There's no treatment that can cure or slow down the progression of Parkinson's. It is treated with levodopa, which is a precursor of dopamine, and this can cross the blood-brain barrier. Surgery and deep brain stimulation have had some success. Causes: certain drugs, pesticide exposure, and frequent blows to the head. There is some genetic component, but it's not directly inherited. All right, let's move into the interior of the brain, the diencephalon. This is between the cerebral hemispheres and above the brainstem. It surrounds a third ventricle, is composed of gray matter. And portions of the diencephalon include the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the optic tracts, the optic chiasma, the infundibulum, the posterior pituitary, the mammillary bodies, and the pineal gland. The thalamus is a gateway for sensory impulses ascending to the cerebral cortex, and it receives all the sensory impulses, except for sense of smell. This channels the impulses to the appropriate parts of the cerebral cortex for interpretation. The hypothalamus, which is right underneath the thalamus, maintains the homeostasis by regulating visceral activities, like heart rate, blood pressure, body temperature, water and electrolyte balance, hunger, body weight, movement and glandular secretion in the digestive tract, sleep and wakefulness, and pituitary gland functions. And the hypothalamus links the nervous and the endocrine systems. Now, we also refer to the limbic system, which consists of several structures in various parts of the brain, which includes the diencephalon. It controls the emotional responses and your feelings and behavior oriented towards survival. So this system helps you react to potentially life-threatening upsets, which are either physical or psychological. Moving downward, we hit the brainstem. It connects the brain to the spinal cord and consists of the midbrain, the pons, and medulla oblongata. It contains nerve fiber tracts and gray matter masses. This is the anterior view of the brainstem and the posterior view. The midbrain. This is a short section of the brainstem and lies between the diencephalon and the pons. It contains bundles of fibers that join the lower parts of the brainstem and spinal cord with the higher part of the brain. The cerebral aqueduct connects the third to the fourth ventricle. The cerebral peduncles are the main motor pathways that connect the cerebrum to the lower portions of the nervous system. The corpora quadrigemina are centers for visual and auditory reflexes. And then the red nucleus plays a role in your posture and your postural reflexes. The pons is a rounded bulge on the underside of the brainstem. It's between the midbrain and the medulla oblongata, and it relays nerve impulses between the medulla oblongata and the cerebrum. It also relays impulses from the cerebrum to the cerebellum, and it helps regulate your rhythm of breathing. The medulla oblongata is the enlarged area, which is a continuation of the spinal cord. It conducts ascending and descending impulses between the brain and spinal cord and contains cardiac, vasomotor, and respiratory control centers. It contains various non-vital reflex control centers like coughing, sneezing, swallowing, and vomiting. Injuries to this area are often fatal. Okay, the reticular formation, also called the reticular activating system. This is a complex network of nerve fibers scattered throughout the brainstem. It extends into the diencephalon, and it connects to the centers of the hypothalamus, basal nuclei, cerebellum, and cerebrum with ascending and descending tracts. It filters incoming sensory information, passing some to the cerebral cortex and discarding unimportant information. It arouses cerebral cortex into a state of wakefulness, and decreased activity will cause sleep. Okay, figure 11.12 here shows you the reticular formation and the brainstem in just a small area, right there below the pons at the medulla oblongata. Speaking of sleep, so sleep's a normal, recurring, and reversible state of unconsciousness, characterized in part by limited sensory input and inhibited skeletal muscle activity. In non-rapid eye movement, or non-REM sleep, you have slow wave sleep here. The person is tired. You have decreasing activity of the reticular formation. This is a restful and dreamless state. You have reduced blood pressure and respiratory rate. There are 3 stages, ranging from light to heavy, and it alternates with REM sleep. In rapid eye movement, or REM sleep, this is also called paradoxical sleep because some areas of the brain are still active. The heart and respiratory rates are irregular during this time, and this is when you're dreaming. Okay, table 11.4 goes over some sleep disorders. Okay, in fatal familial insomnia, this is the inability to sleep and emotional instability. You also have hallucinations, stupor, coma, death within 13 months of the onset around age 50 for this, and both slow wave and REM sleep are abolished in this case, and that's quite rare. Insomnia, this is the ability or the inability to fall or remain asleep, and this occurs at any time in 10% of the population. Narcolepsy, this is abnormal REM sleep, which causes extreme daytime sleepiness and begins between the ages of 15 and 25. Only 0.02 to 0.06% of the population has this. Obstructive sleep apnea syndrome. The upper airway collapses repeatedly during sleep, and it blocks breathing. Snoring and daytime sleepiness are common for this. This occurs in 4 to 5% of people. Parasomnias. This is sleepwalking or sleep talking or night terrors, and this occurs most often in children, but only in less than 5%. REM sleep behavior disorder. Excessive motor activity during REM sleep, which disturbs continuous sleep, and this is quite rare. Restless leg syndrome. This is a brief, repetitive leg jerks during sleep. Leg pain will force a person to get up several times a night. Occurs in 5.5% of the population. And sleep paralysis. This is the inability to move for up to a few minutes after awakening or when falling asleep. And this is quite rare. Okay, at the back of the brain and underneath, we have the cerebellum. So it's inferior to the occipital lobes. It's dorsal to the pons and medulla oblongata. It has 2 hemispheres that are separated by the falx cerebelli. The vermis connects the hemispheres. The cerebellar cortex is gray matter, and the arbor vitae is the white matter. Cerebellar peduncles also are found, and a dentate nucleus, which is the largest nucleus. The cerebellum integrates sensory information concerning body position of your body parts. It coordinates skeletal muscle activity, maintains your posture, and recent studies suggest other possible roles for the cerebellum, which include interaction with other parts of the cerebral cortex, such as the limbic system and the auditory areas. Okay, figure 11.13 shows you the cerebellum. All right, table 11.5 summarizes major parts of the brain. It talks about its characteristics and functions that we have already talked about, but you would like to use this table in studying for your upcoming exams. Clinical application, brain waves. So these are recordings of fluctuating electrical changes in the brain, and commonly recorded from electroencephalograms, or an EEG, the electrodes on the scalp that detect electrical changes in electrocellular fluid of the brain. The EEG is based on potential changes in a large group of neurons. And there's 4 types of brain waves: the alpha, at awake or resting and eyes closed; the beta, which are active mental activity under tension; theta, mostly in children, but in some adults during sleep or stress; and the delta waves, which are mainly during sleep. And this figure shows you those different types of brain waves in examples. Okay, moving down to the spinal cord. This is a slender column of nervous tissue continuous with the brain and the brainstem. It extends downward through the vertebral canal and begins at the foramen magnum at the base of the skull and terminates at the first and second lumbar vertebrae, the L1 to the L2 space. It consists of 31 segments, and each gives rise to a pair of spinal nerves. The spinal nerves are grouped according to the level of the vertebra with which they are associated. And within each group, the pairs of nerves are numbered in the sequence from superior to inferior. Okay, portions of the spinal cord in the longitudinal section include the cervical enlargement, which supplies nerves to the upper limbs; the lumbar enlargement, which supplies nerves to the lower limbs; the conus medullaris, which is a tapering region below the lumbar enlargement; the filum terminale, which is cord of connective tissue that anchors the spinal cord to the coccyx; and the cauda equina, which is a group of lumbar and sacral nerves that extend downward from the conus medullaris in the vertebral canal. In cross-section, structure of the spinal cord shows an anterior median fissure and posterior median sulcus, which are grooves that extend the whole length of the spinal cord. White matter surrounds a core of gray matter. Gray matter is arranged in horns, and white matter is arranged in funiculi, or columns. The posterior roots contain sensory neurons, and cell bodies are outside the spinal cord in the posterior root ganglia. The anterior roots contain motor neurons, and the gray commissure surrounds a central canal. Okay, this shows you areas of the spinal cord in the longitudinal section. This figure shows a cross-section of the spinal cord. And notice again, the gray matter is in the center, kind of in a butterfly shape, and the white matter surrounds that. When we name the white matter parts, we talk about funiculi. So you have a posterior funiculus, a lateral funiculus, and an anterior funiculus. When we talk about parts of the gray matter, we refer to horns. So you have posterior horn, a lateral horn, and anterior horn. And of course, you can use the terms of ventral and dorsal instead of anterior and posterior. Okay, notice it is divided by an anterior median fissure at the front and a posterior median sulcus at the back. You also have a posterior root of the spinal cord, and you have an anterior root, and we'll talk more about those later. Okay, 2 main functions of the spinal cord. It's a center for spinal reflexes and a conduit or pathway for impulses to and from the brain. When we talk about a reflex, we're talking about an automatic subconscious response to a stimulus within or outside the body. It maintains homeostasis by controlling involuntary processes, such as heart rate and blood pressure, swallowing, and coughing. In reflex arcs, we have a neural pathway consisting of a sensory receptor and 2 or more neurons, and then an effector. The simple reflex arc contains only a sensory and motor neuron. The most common reflex arc, though, contains a sensory neuron, an interneuron, and a motor neuron. Okay, and this figure shows you that schematic of a reflex arc. You have a receptor, and so you have a sensory, or also called afferent neuron, which comes into the central nervous system and then goes back out through the motor or efferent neuron to the effector. And the effector is the thing that responds, like a muscle or a gland. Okay, this figure shows you the components of a reflex arc. So you have a receptor, and here it shows like a receptor in the skin, maybe a pain receptor. And that information flows to the sensory neuron. It goes into the posterior root, going into the spinal cord. Okay, so you have a sensory neuron here, basically in that posterior root. It goes into an interneuron in the spinal cord through the gray matter. And at that interneuron connects with a motor neuron or efferent neuron, which then goes out of the anterior root to the effector, which is a muscle or gland. Okay, table 11.6 goes over the different parts of a reflex arc. All right, when we talk about reflex behavior, we can talk about a monosynaptic stretch reflex or withdrawal reflex. In the monosynaptic stretch reflex, we have 2 neurons, a sensory and a motor, and it has only 1 synapse in the spinal cord. Examples are the typical types of reflexes you think of, like the patellar or knee jerk reflex. And there's a real purpose in this. It helps maintain an upright posture. This is elicited when you hit a tendon and it causes the muscle to be pulled. And that automatically sets this into action. It does not have to go through the brain. The withdrawal reflex, this occurs when a person touches or steps on something painful. So you could touch a stove or you could step on a tack, and it prevents or limits tissue damage by removing the limb from painful stimuli. It can be polysynaptic, where you have where you have a sensory neuron, interneuron, and a motor neuron, or reciprocal innervation, where the flexors contract and extensors are inhibited. And this figure shows you a stretch reflex, in this case, a patellar reflex. This figure shows you a withdrawal reflex. Okay, and a cross extensor reflex. So this is during a withdrawal reflex. The flexors are affected ipsilaterally, and so the affected side contracts and the extensors are inhibited. And at the same time, the extensors on the opposite side, or the contralateral side, contract and the flexors are inhibited. Also, this shifts your body weight so the person remains upright. This figure shows you the crossed extensor reflex. Okay, the clinical application, uses of reflexes. So reflexes are used to assess condition of the nervous system. And this is routinely performed in neurological testing. In patients with nervous system injury, the location and extent of damage can be judged by testing the reflexes. Effectiveness of anesthetics during surgery can also be assessed through reflex testing. And examples include a knee jerk reflex, plantar reflex, biceps jerk reflex, triceps jerk reflex, abdominal reflex, ankle jerk reflex, and cremasteric reflex. All right, next let's talk about ascending and descending tracts. Ascending tracts conduct sensory impulses to the brain, and they're usually shown as pink in our figures. The descending tracts conduct motor impulses from the brain via motor neurons reaching muscles and glands, and we show those as light brown. Tracts are composed of axons. So the major ascending or sensory spinal cord tracts are the fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus, also the spinothalamic tracts, and the spinocerebellar tracts. The major descending or motor spinal cord tracts are the corticospinal tracts, the reticulospinal tracts, and the rubrospinal tracts. Okay, and this figure shows you the major ascending and descending tracts. These figures show you the major ascending and descending tracts and their crossover locations. Table 11.7 goes over the nerve tracts of the spinal cord and explains the purposes of each and where they are. Okay, clinical application. Amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. This is also called Lou Gehrig's disease or motor neuron disease. This involves degeneration of the motor neurons in the spinal cord, the brainstem, and cerebral cortex. Possible causes are overactive microglia that kill neurons, buildup of oxygen-free radicals that neurons or astrocytes cannot counter also. Symptoms: speaking difficulties, dragging a foot, clumsiness, fatigue, coordination issues, muscle twitches, and weakness. In cognitive, in this case, the cognitive function usually remains normal. It is usually fatal in 2 to 5 years, though, due to respiratory problems. And 10% of these cases are inherited. There is no cure. Okay, spinal cord injuries. The most common causes are workplace and motor vehicle accidents, and severity depends on the extent and location of damage. Compression or distortion of the spinal cord can result in damage to or death of neurons, which leads to pain, weakness, loss of sensation, and muscular atrophy. The central nervous system neurons do not regenerate. Injury to the ascending tracts can result in the loss of sensation, and injury to descending tracts can result in the loss of motor function, paralysis. Research is looking into ways of limiting damage after injury, like growth factors and stem cells. And we're going to end this presentation here, and we'll pick up in another presentation to go over the peripheral nervous system.